Hi all, it's me again, and I am going to digress a little from what I've been talking about because someone requested that I talk about my first encounter with apartheid, so I thought I would cover that. I was intending to cover it later on, but they've requested that, so I decided to do this video. Okay, so to be honest with you, I am going to leave a lot of stuff out here because there's just so much like that I remember from my childhood growing up in the countryside and growing up in the townships of South Africa. So there's no way for me to cover this in a video without boring you to death, I think, unless you're really interested in knowing how life was. But there were like growing up under apartheid was really a very complicated mess that had mostly bad parts, but it had some bright spots. A backstory. So you already know the history of South Africa and the apartheid. If you don't know it, please Google it. There's plenty of information out there. But just to give you a brief story, South Africa was divided according to South Africa proper and tribal areas called Bandustans. Stan, I think, is state in Arabic, and Bantu is really Bantu, which means people, which is a group of black people, distinct group of people that inhabited Southern Africa. So the apartheid government created these tribal states called the TBVC states. Those were the main ones. I believe that there were other ones that were smaller. So it created this that meant that if you wanted to travel between those states and South Africa proper, you had to carry a passport, or what South Africans refer to as the Dom pass or Dumb pass in English. And they detested this because they felt that it was adding an unnecessary burden on them and their ability to move freely. But it was obviously a part of a method of controlling people and making sure that they were accounted for in a way. So in order for you to be in proper South Africa, you kind of had to have a job and be mostly male and single women. Later on they did accept married women, but in general they preferred single women and men, because men could do like the manual labor and work in the mines, and women could clean the houses and do all the menial labor as well. So I think another reason for this was because the apartheid government did not really want to assume the responsibility of people who bring their children into South Africa proper. So leaving the children in the countryside with either grandparents or with their mothers was their way of not assuming responsibility. They could use the men for the labor, and once they're done with them, those people retire back into the countryside. In fact, that's still very much a tradition in South Africa, where people work in the cities and they retire back into the countryside. So again, this was their way of avoiding responsibilities. They did, however, build some schools in the countryside, in the cities, and they built these houses called hostels, but again, they were just designed to be as basic as possible, so that people continue to work basically in the cities for literally nothing, because the salary was so low that you could only afford to live in a squatter camp or in a very small, like hostel sharing with other men, which really took the dignity of a lot of men away, because it was like, in a way, you are in prison, because you couldn't bring your wife here, and if you did bring your wife, you would still have to share that accommodation with other men as well. So that was, again, another downside of apartheid, and also the further breakdown of the family. So So I was born in South Africa proper, which is Cape Town, South Africa. And before the age of 2, my mother, who was a single mother at the time, moved me and my sisters to live with my grandmother in one of the tribal areas called Transkei, because the reason is that we are Xhosa. I don't know if you can say Xhosa, but we are Xhosa, and so my grandmother lived in the village there. So she moved us over there while she was settling her life, basically. So until the age of 6 years old, I lived in Transkei. Over there was nothing like, it was a typical African village. No running water, no electricity, dependent on wood and, like farm animals. People lived a complete subsistence farming, and they depended completely on the land. And so that just was the way of life. And it was a peaceful way of life in a way, because people were living in closed culture. And the only time there were no white people, except for, there were some white people, but the only time that I ever saw this white person was when I was probably close to 6 years old. He was coming to pick up my grandma to take her to a doctor, I think, but that was the only time. So before that, I really had no idea how white people look like, how different they are, because when I left Cape Town, I was a baby. So up until the age of 6, I lived there with my grandmother. Really peaceful time of my life. Hard looking back, but at the time I really didn't feel that way, because I was just a kid. So to start 2nd grade, but because I had started school in the rural areas, they wanted me to redo 1st grade, because I didn't have a report card. In the rural areas, there were no report cards at the time. You just passed and you were moved to a different class. And so they wanted me to repeat 1st grade, which I'm still mad about. But I'm kidding. So I had to redo 1st grade that year. And again, I moved to a place called Guguletu. And there were black people lived in what was considered, or what was called, townships. And here in America, those would be what you call ghettos. But they were different, I think, maybe because I think a person could do whatever they wanted to do in terms of extending the house, making it bigger and such. But I don't know, because my mother didn't have a house actually there. We lived in a shack in one of these houses in Guguletu. And so basically you had carriage houses. And these carriage houses, like, they were long, and they would go from from the beginning of the block to the end of the block. And they were just like row houses, I think, in Maryland or Washington, D.C. So you have these row houses, and then they had very long backyards. And so to make a little bit of money, the people who were given the key to live in that house, black people, would have people come in and plop their shack, build it up, and they could live there. So my mother lived like that. She had her own house. At the time, I believe she was working for First National Bank, but because she was black, she could only make tea. And she wasn't allowed to do anything beyond just, like manual labor. And so but we were grateful, of course, because she had a job and she could put, food on our table. And so, but at the time I didn't know anything. I just knew that my mother had a job, so that was cool for us. So I started 1st grade, and I was hit by a car because I grew up in the rural areas. I really didn't have a it's not even that. We were kids. We were coming back from school and we were playing. We weren't really careful, and we were playing. And so I was hit by a car and I was unconscious. And after I was hit by a car, I didn't know what was happening, but there was a trial. I'm not sure what the trial, because I was still a kid, like maybe around like 6, 7 years old. And there was a trial. I remember some of my friends testifying on my behalf about what exactly happened. And so you could say this was my first real encounter with the apartheid system, in that according to what I was told, I was taken to the police station because at the time they didn't allow ambulance, like you couldn't even call an ambulance and have it come and pick up a person, or if you did, it would take, you know, like forever. But I was taken to a police station, and I was I remember, just the only thing I remember about that encounter was that I was the landlord, because my mother was working and there were no cell phones at that point. The landlord had taken me. They went and called the landlord, and then she was the one who took me to the police station so that they could wait for an ambulance there. And when I came to, I just saw that my leg was broken, and you know, like, and I was just drifting in and out of consciousness. And so she finally took me to, the ambulance came and took me to Grooteskir Hospital, or I think Groot means great in Afrikaans, Skir Hospital, so great or big hospital. She took me to the hospital. There I was of course taken care of, and you know, like, given a great service, even though I was a black kid. But a lot of people didn't know that I was a black kid, not even the driver that had hit me, who was black. According to my friends, he asked, what is this colored girl doing in a black area? So in South Africa, colored means that you are of mixed race, and if you're black, you are totally black. But I wasn't even mixed. It's just that I'm light skinned because I have maybe a mild case of albinism. I don't know. But my mother is not very dark either. She could pass for a colored, and so this person thought I was a colored kid, but he, as a black person, thought that I was in a wrong place to be even there, and that was his defense, basically. And but anyway, so that was my first experience with how apartheid affected a person on the street. That's from my own experience. And these are early 80s, so we went on. Just to backtrack, so I told you, right, we didn't have like white people in the countryside, right? We had I had seen this man one time. So when I first encountered white people, I saw people were different, not, you know, like in a bad way, but just different. They looked different. They had different hair. They have different colored eyes, and that was probably the one thing that was fascinating to me as a kid, right? And they were shaped, of course, differently. So I remember when we first moved to Cape Town, my sister and I were in the bus with my mother. My other two sisters were left with my grandma to continue, because they were a little bit older, to continue to live in the countryside. But the funny thing is, we go to this major town, border town called Queenstown, and so that's where South Africa proper really started, and you could see a complete difference in terms of tarred roads, in terms of cars, lots of cars, and all of that. So my sister and I, we see white people everywhere, and we're like, like, meaning white person, and we are little kids. We were not even mocking, but we were just like shocked that there were so many white people in this area. So and I still remember them, like the ladies, they look like the Dallas, you know, like ladies you see on television. That's how they looked. But anyway, so then back to Cape Town. So my first encounter, I had an accident. I came out of the hospital. In the hospital, I was taken care. I remember this lady, she was a colored lady, and she used to take care of me, brush my hair. I hated the whole hospital experience, but I was there. But anyway, so I came out. So 1980, so my mother, in 1985, the South African government opened what we called at the time Site C, and it was like a tent city with the government would put a tent, a toilet, a bucket system toilet, and they would put it there, and then they would give you your number, and then that's your own stand. And there were no real roads, there were numbers to the tents, but there were no like real roads. Everything was makeshift. There were no tarred roads, and so it was like a refugee camp, so to speak. And so my mother jumped at the opportunity because they thought that they would, like get housing, and she would then maybe get something. But the South African government said basically build your own shack, and the shacks are still there, by the way. So the government said build your own shack. So my mother, being a single mother, had the hardest time because every man in the whole neighborhood was basically building their own shack, and so she didn't have anyone really. So my sisters who were older than me had to learn how to nail things, and we had an uncle who would come in whenever he wasn't working in his own house. He would come in and help. So and so that was very hard. A lot of people were sick because it was cold. We went there around April. I think the whole area was open. So right there after that, it was going to be winter because South African winters around June. He would come and help us, like set up our makeshift house. Basically, my sisters learned how to nail things and stuff, and so because we had a bucket system, these men that were their job was to pick up the buckets, like I think once or twice a week. I can't remember, once a week. They would boycott and throw the whole thing on the streets, like everywhere, to make a point to the South African government. So you can understand why there was so much sickness. That was part of the problem. So, but we lived there in 1985. In 1985, really is the time when a lot of rioting starts happening in South Africa. And about Nelson Mandela, by the way, Nelson Mandela, we really didn't know. We weren't allowed to put up a picture of him. We weren't allowed to own anything that was political. We weren't allowed to listen to music that was political. We were like in North Korea today. And so there were police everywhere. So riots and stuff would be organized, but they would be like more like impromptu, at least appeared to be impromptu to us, because there were no meetings that were allowed. You weren't even allowed to assemble on the street as young black men. And so these young men that we called comrades would just appear out of nowhere, basically destroying everything that they could, that they thought the government that helped the government in any way, just making the country ungovernable, destabilize the country, because the attitude was that if people were living under the conditions that they were living, it was really not worth it. That was the first time I ever saw an image of Nelson Mandela, because these young men were wearing t-shirts. They were UDF members, and some of them were UDM. And so, but all the other organizations were still banned at the time. So there was no real political climate. It was just an underground struggle at the time, and we would just see things happening, and we really didn't know what was happening. So one of these nights, there were riots, and I woke up the following day going to school, and I was in elementary school or primary school at the time. I wake up and I go to school. on my way to school, this was one of the things that I remember about that period. There were people who were charred, were burned to death on our street, and I was going to school, and I just remember coming into, like, walking and just being stopped on my tracks because I see this human being that had been burned into like almost a ball, okay? And I was just like so scared. I just turned around the shacks, and then I ran like nobody's business, like to my school. But I still went to school because I couldn't miss school. I love being in school, and I just could not do without school. And it was a place to hang out, to learn, to do everything. So I enjoyed going to school. So I remember just being so traumatized by that. But we did not talk about what was going on. We didn't have counselors to say, oh, you know, like, this is what happened, who suffered. No, there was no such thing. Because, like, our culture in general, they believe that, you know, time is the best healer, and things do come, you know, like, to an end, you know, and if you don't talk about them, that's not a bad thing. So we never really talked about them, about the things that we saw, at least not, you know, with our families, except, okay, I saw this, okay, yeah, you did, let's move on, kind of an attitude. And my mother, you know, like, she was a working mother, and you know, like, all she cared about was making sure that her children were safe and her children had food on their table, and she was going to work, you know. And so that was her first priority. And then during the riots, she would help out where she could, with, you know, like, with the young men who would either come in and running from the police would be chasing them, and she would open her house and have them hide or whatever. And it was not just her, or many people did that, they allowed that. And but what complicated things was that in South Africa, the South African government realized, okay, we don't want to get the blame in general, so let's hire a lot of black people as neighborhood police. But these people, their job was to keep black people in line so that they don't riot, or if they see something, they can alert the government, you know, like, they were basically working for the South African government, not for the community. And I mean, a lot of men joined because they were just, you know, trying to survive for their own. And that's really, you know, the story of apartheid, is trying to survive and making sure that, you know, like, you can wake up tomorrow and call it another day. And so a lot of people would compromise their own principles, because not a lot, but a few people would compromise their own principles because they just want a job and they just want to survive. And that's where the strife really happened. So this was around 1985, and we went through the riots. And 1987, the 90s, early 90s, usher in the end of apartheid as we know it. A new constitution is drafted in South Africa in 1994. We had the first election, one man, one vote election, for the first time ever. The ANC won in a landslide. I can't remember the percentages, but basically we were in a euphoric state with every change that was going on in the country. We were so excited with the Rainbow Nation, and a new constitution, as I said, was drafted and adopted in 1996. There's still a lot of way to go in South Africa, because there's just so much that still needs to be rebuilt. And I think people have gotten over the euphoria of the end of apartheid, and they want to see real change at this point. I do remember American media was very much interested in knowing what the average man on the street was thinking, and the average, you know, like, young person. And I had an opportunity to be interviewed by Ted Koppel of ABC. I hope one day they will give me that interview. I tried to get hold of it, but I have not been successful. But there are archive records of my interview with them. and he actually did quote me, so I'm hoping that I'll be able one day to get that interview. But again, things have changed in South Africa for the better. Regardless of what people are saying, there's still a long way to go, and a lot that needs to be done, and that will really be up to the next generation, or this generation preparing for the next generation, and understanding that, you know, we may have to forego the spoils as this generation, in hopes that the future generations will have a better South Africa than what we currently have. So I hope you enjoyed this. I will, in most of my videos, talk about you know, my experiences there, here and there, because there are a lot of things that I've left out. So I will kind of just you know, talk about my experiences as I remember them, because there's just so much that I couldn't cover here. Hey all, thank you so much for watching so far. This is part 1. It's a long history, okay? I'm a little old, so I have a lot to say, and I know that I'm long-winded, but please catch part 2, and it's gonna be very interesting. I'm going to start in 1987 and move forward, and that's the exciting part actually, because I am telling my story towards the end of apartheid, and that was very interesting. Okay, thank you.